Welcome to Philosophy and Faith, where our goal is to help you navigate your intellectual and spiritual journey, especially in regards to topics like God, faith and doubt, meaning and purpose, and more. I'm Nathan Beasley.
And I'm Daniel Jepson. And together we discuss the big questions that humans have wrestled with for thousands of years.
We're glad you can join us.
And we are back.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've had a trip and then I had COVID. So we've had a little gap there in our recording schedule.
Yeah. How are you doing? How was the trip?
It was wonderful. Went out to Tahoe, visited with my sister, and did some incredible hiking. They have the best hiking.
Really the best?
The best I've been to.
So for those of you who don't know, Daniel is an avid outdoorsman.
That's probably overselling that, but I do like to hike. And then we're also going to have to work on our production schedule when you go on maternity leave soon.
Yeah, paternity leave.
Paternity leave.
That's right. I'm not having the baby, my wife is, but I get the benefits of having the baby without the delivery. So
yes, so you'll be off like a month.
Yeah, so we were just talking and no updates on what that's going to look like yet. Still planning to record, but may have some other co-host.
Might have a substitute.
Substitute. I like it.
Yeah. So we're still working on that.
Yeah. So were the trees changing colors yet in Tahoe?
So the thing is, out there they have evergreen of different kinds, and then they have aspen, which turn yellow.
Oh,
so
okay.
there were some places where they were turning yellow, and it's very beautiful. So you've got this, not like it's Midwest or New England where you've got this rainbow of trees, got green and yellow, but it's actually very beautiful in its own way.
Nice. Yeah. And you sent some pictures, and there was red, and there was blue, but just not in the trees so much.
Yeah, there was this grass or shrub that turned this bright red up in the high mountains. Got some good pictures of that.
Yeah, cool.
But we're not here to talk about that, I suppose.
No, but it is fun.
It is.
I love the changing colors and everything. So
I do too. We're here to talk about Socrates.
Who?
Socrates.
Okay.
You heard of him?
I believe I have heard of him.
You were just talking about a movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
Yeah, I think he's one of the main characters, next to Bill and Ted, but he's part of the Excellent Adventure. Huh. Socrates, as they call him.
They call him Socrates? I have not seen that particular treasure. No.
Treasure is absolutely the correct word for that.
Okay, I'll have to check it out sometime.
That should have been your homework or preparation
won't.
For the episode.
I should have. I missed that.
Seeing how the pop culture reference actually matches the historical evidence.
Okay, so again, I haven't seen the movie, but it sounds like it's kind of analogous to what actually happened in Greece, because Socrates became more of a literary figure than a historical figure. At least that's what's most important, or what we remember him for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was a real guy. He wasn't a made-up dude, but we primarily remember him for the way that Plato is going to use him as a literary figure in his dialogues.
Gotcha. So why don't you frame this for us a little bit? You mentioned Plato. So what's the relationship between them, and what time and context are we kind of thinking about here?
All right. All this is now going to be in Athens.
Okay.
So all the other philosophers we've talked about have been in Greece or Greek-controlled areas. But now it's going to be more centered for a while on Athens.
And we're not talking about Athens, Georgia, ladies and gentlemen.
No, Greece, actually. So all the philosophers we have talked about before are often labeled in the history of philosophy as the pre-Socratics. So that tells you right off the bat that, hey, someone's here that's making a difference. There are actually three philosophers that are tied very closely together historically as well as thematically, and that is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Now, of those three, Socrates did not write one line, at least not that we have any record of. But he was the tutor or the mentor to Plato. And then Plato is the mentor or the tutor to Aristotle. So you've got a lineage of three incredibly important names.
Gotcha. And what time frame?
I was just hoping you'd ask that, actually. So Socrates, 469 to 399.
BC?
Yeah.
Okay.
Plato, 427 to 347. And then Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC. And then Aristotle's most famous pupil, do you know who that was?
Aristotle's what?
Most famous pupil? He wasn't a philosopher.
Aristotle's most famous pupil would have been St. Thomas Aquinas.
No, you're off a few centuries there. Alexander the Great.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So not a philosopher, but I'm sure he picked up some philosophy there.
But you like my answer, though.
That was
It's
oh,
pretty clever
that was
if you think
an
about
answer.
it.
Anyway, so there's again about 40 years separating each one,
Okay.
give or take. And Socrates did not start a school. Plato started a school. Aristotle started his own. Socrates did not write anything, but he had a profound effect on Plato. And Plato and Aristotle are the two biggest influencers in Western thought, or at least Western philosophy, and arguably Western thought as a whole, I would think. So the reason we want to talk about Socrates is because of that lineage. He becomes a very important figure in Western thought.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Cool. So let's get into a little bit of his thought.
All right, let's do it. So last episode, we talked about the Sophists, and we mentioned that Socrates was their antagonist. He was opposed to them.
And so for those who haven't caught that yet, give us a little definition of it.
No, they got to go back and listen to the whole thing.
Make them do their homework.
Yeah, that's right. No, the Sophists were traveling advisors to especially young men who were trying to advance. So they had a philosophy, but it was basically one of self-improvement. It was focused on what you should do, how you should advance in life. So there were philosophical principles that they taught, but for the most part, they also practiced and sometimes taught the idea that there was not an absolute truth that you would attach yourself to or that you could even discover. So the goal of life is to get ahead, to understand what you should do. And Socrates was diametrically opposed to the idea that you can't know absolute truth. He says it is unacceptable to hold that position, both pragmatically because of the way it turns you into someone who's just out for the next buck or personal advancement. That's what not philosophy is about. But also because to say there is no absolute truth is to commit a very fundamental self-defeating argument, because you're making a truth statement, and at the same time that truth statement undermines the ability to make truth statements. And we talked about that last.
Gotcha. So he is going to hold to the fact that there is absolute truth.
Yes.
And that shapes what people do in their life.
He is. But paradoxically, he's also going to say, I don't really know anything. I don't know the truth about these things. So he's also going to adopt a studied stance of ignorance. Now, what I mean by that is his whole shtick, as it were, is to say, hey, I don't know what justice is, or I don't know what beauty is, or I don't know what goodness is. Would you teach me? And so he'll talk to somebody else. Again, this is at least as Plato describes him. And then as they try to describe those things, he shows that they don't know either, even though they're using the terms all the time.
How does he show that they don't know?
By the method of dialogue. So we would call it Socratic dialogue today in his honor.
Gotcha. So he's just asking questions
for the most part,
trying to dig down deeper.
Yes.
Until there's some sort of contradiction or something, in which case he slaps in the face and says, haha, sucker, and walks away.
That's exactly what happens, more or less. So what he's known for is not any specific doctrine that he taught, although he did believe in absolute truth and goodness. He was not known for any doctrines he taught, but rather his influence on Plato, his life and how he lived it and how he died, and then thirdly, his method, the Socratic dialogue. So we've talked a little bit about his influence on Plato, and maybe let's just explore that for a second.
Sure.
Socrates is going to be the key figure in most of Plato's dialogues. It's not the case, however, that Plato is describing an actual conversation. Plato is using him as a literary figure for his own purposes. Most philosophers or historians feel, however, that at least in the earlier dialogues of Plato, that he is more or less describing what Socrates actually was doing and how he thought. So they would view him as, at least in the early dialogues, yes, they're works of fiction in the sense that this conversation was not probably stenographically recorded that way. but they more or less capture what Socrates was doing. In the later dialogues, most historians feel Plato's doing his own thing, but he's still using Socrates as a mouthpiece, as it were.
I see. So he becomes more of a legendary character, kind of, I guess.
Yeah,
I
in
don't
one
know.
sense, without all the miracles and all that
Yeah.
usually go with legends.
Okay. So he's got this method. Plato records it. He's an actual guy. Early on, those dialogues probably pretty closely emulate what Socrates is doing later on, probably mostly just Aristotle taking the reins and running with him. Plato.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, I think also because of what that dynamic, that whole way that Socrates went about, that is by questioning and then questioning the question or the answers, ad infinitum, that kind of set Plato up for the way that he would write his philosophy, because his writing is all going to be in this dialogical form, or dialectical form more technically. And Plato has incredible influence for many reasons, but one of them is the style that he's going to use.
Yeah.
It's going to be these dialogues, and they're brilliant. They are so much easier to read. They're incredibly more engaging than almost any philosopher who's ever written.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that there isn't more of that style of writing more.
I am too.
I mean, you can just see the natural rhythm of a conversation happening, natural counterpoints happening, and that kind of a thing.
Yeah. I think the only big name philosopher who does this consistently and well would be David Hume, an Englishman, and that was, almost 2,000 years later there.
Yeah. Have you read Peter Kreeft's work?
Oh yeah, he does it brilliantly.
Yeah, he's pretty good.
Yeah, he gets the memo there.
Yeah, and I've read some of his work, and like you said, it's easy to read and understand, and almost a good like reference book for. I mean, you can see the arguments and you can see them unfold just in a very natural kind of conversational way.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. Lost my train of thought there for a second. So most philosophers are very difficult to read, and the secondary sources, the people writing about them, are easier because they kind of summarize and explain. With Plato, it's the opposite. If you want to understand Plato, just read Plato. Don't read so much about what people are saying about him, because none of them are going to be as consistent and engaging as Plato himself. Anyway, so there's that influence on Plato in theme, but also in style and form.
And you still see that just in the way that conversations happen or dialogue happens nowadays? I mean, that's part of the influence you feel like of Socrates?
Maybe. I mean, obviously they're pretty far removed. I suppose you could trace a thread if you really wanted to.
So
You want to talk about his life?
let's talk about his life.
All right. We don't know much about it.
Okay. All right. Next.
We know more about his death. So what we do know of his life is that he apparently went around Athens just pestering people with these questions and showing them that they really didn't know what they were talking about.
Sounds like a good job.
Yeah. So he was a bit of a gadfly. He's described by another writer, not Plato, as being a gadfly, but also being kind of ugly and obtrusive and lacking in social graces. Don't know if that's really true or not. But we do have a pretty good understanding of how he met his death. Because of some of the way he did things, he stirred up a lot of annoyance and even anger at people in Athens, especially the powerful, because he often showed that they had no idea what they were talking about. So he was condemned to death, and the charges were basically corrupting youth by not honoring the Greek gods. Now, when that happened, and again, this is going to be an influence on Plato because he was there, this occurs in a society that's a democracy. Okay, Athens is a democracy by this point. Probably, you could argue, the first real democracy on at least a large citywide scale. And they condemn him to death, his hero, the one person that he looks up to as being someone who's actually seeking truth. Now, this is a condemnation of death, but it was also kind of understood that he could get away by just, taking him out of Athens, taking himself out of Greece. It would not have been difficult to do. He had that offer. But he chose to stay in Athens and to drink the hemlock because he wanted to show that the charges were false, that he was actually obedient to the city government, that he would follow the laws, he was not disrupting public order or the stability of the city, and also to show that he wasn't afraid of death. So there is this very moving scene Plato describes about the trial and the death of Socrates, and his younger students are gathered around weeping, and he gently rebukes them, saying, look, guys, you don't get it. This is a good thing for me. My soul was like imprisoned in this body, and now it will soon be free. I don't have to fear this death, and I don't want you to fear it either. And then he drinks the hemlock. So he becomes the first martyr for philosophy. Again, it's a very moving scene and had a profound effect on Plato. In particular, he really distrusted, maybe even hated, that might be too strong a word, democracies from that point on. And so he's going to build his own political theory called the Republic. And it will not be a democracy. It will be the rule of people who know what they're doing, philosopher kings, not this crowd that gives way to ignorance and mob mentality. So that's also part of Socrates' influence, is the way that he sought for truth and he died for truth.
Wow.
Yeah. So
That's pretty intense.
yeah, that is. And then what's the other thing I said we were talking about here? Plato, the Socratic method. One theme you can already see that he did seem to uphold, at least Plato understood him this way, is the immortality of the soul, or even the transmigration of the soul. Immortality just means the soul won't die. Transmigration would be like reincarnation, that it migrates to a different form, a different physical form. And that's going to come into play in Plato's philosophy big time. And then I was going to read some of one of the dialogues to illustrate the way he utilized the Socratic method. So I'll do that. It'll probably take 5 or 7 minutes. But do you have any questions?
No, I think it's good.
Okay. So this is in the Republic. And just give a little background. Plato's writing this again. This probably did not happen, at least not quite this way. But in this dialogue, Socrates is meeting these other people and they're talking, and he begins to question them in this way. And this goes on for a long time. I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously. But there's a wealthy man. He begins asking him about the blessings of his wealth. What does it mean to be blessed in this way? And he gives an answer, this wealthy man, about hope. Hope, he says, cherishes the soul of him who lives in justice and holiness, and is the nurse of his age and the companion of his journey. And Socrates says, how admirable are his words. But he says, but concerning justice, okay, so in other words, so you brought up this word justice, right?
So this is Socrates asking this question. Okay.
Yeah. What is it? To speak the truth and pay your debts? That's what he implied in a previous paragraph. No more than this? And even when there are not exceptions? Suppose that a friend, when in his right mind, has deposited weapons with me, and then he asks them for them when he is not in his right mind, should I give them back to him? No one would say that I ought, or that I should be right in doing so, any more than they would say that I always speak the truth to one who is in his condition. You are quite right, he replied. But then, I said, speaking the truth and paying your debts is not the correct definition of justice. Quite correct, Socrates. And then one of the characters bows out. I fear, said Sophists, that I must go now, for I have to look after the sacrifices. And I hand over the argument to Polemarchus and the company. Is not Polemarchus your heir? I said. To be sure, he answered. And then he went away laughing to the sacrifice. So this guy's like, yeah, I know where this is going. I don't want any part of this. I've seen this worked out. So he looks to Polemarchus. Tell me then, thou heir of the argument, what did they mean about justice? He said that the repayment of a debt is just, and in saying so, he appears to me to be right. So that's his definition of justice. You give to people what's due to them, or you pay them back. And Socrates says, well, I should be sorry to doubt the word of such a wise and inspired man. I think his tongue is in his cheek here. But his meaning, though probably clear to you, is not very clear to me. For certainly he does not mean, as we were just now saying, that I ought to return a deposit of weapons or of anything else to one who asks of it when he is not in his right senses. And yet, a deposit like that cannot be denied to be a debt. True. So here you begin the Socratic dialogue. The other person says, true. Then when a person who asks me is not in their right mind, I am by no means to make the return. Certainly not. So when Simonides said that the repayment of a debt was justice, he did not mean to include that case. Certainly not, for he thinks that a friend ought always to do good to a friend and never evil. You mean then that the return of a deposit of gold, which is to the injury of the receiver, if the two parties are friends, is not the repayment of the debt? Is that what you would imagine him to say? Yes. And are enemies also to receive what we owe them? To be sure, they are to receive what we owe them, that is to say, evil. So, I'm just giving an example, I'm going to cut it off here. It goes on a long ways. His point is, again, going back to this definition of justice. Okay, this is what you say it is, but let's explore this a little bit. Certainly you don't mean this or this or this or this. And by the end of this, you realize that the person who's using these terms so freely has no idea what they mean. And Socrates says, I don't know either, but at least I know that I don't know.
So, and he just does that by just trying to make a muck of the conversation. And what's he like? What's his point?
That's what they wanted to know. And that's why they got really annoyed with him. But I think his point is basically twofold. Number one is to get some intellectual humility going on here so that we understand that we're using terms without thinking of them very well. And really, we should be much more cautious in how we're using terms. And I think the second point is that it's by thinking through and examining things like this in this way that you're really going to make any progress actually knowing what justice might be.
So at the end of the conversation, do they get to an idea or concept of what justice is?
No. And that's usually the case with his dialogues, is that they are inconclusive.
But at least they've shed off some of what it doesn't mean, I guess.
Yes. They've cleared the woods so that they can begin building.
Yeah.
And in this case, Plato is going to be the builder.
So Plato's gonna pick up on it after having paved the way a little bit with clearing the woods.
Yeah. So in some of the dialogues, then again, the later ones, and they're not quite all this back and forth, but you do get a more positive sense. And of course, Plato is going to develop not just this negative style, but he is going to develop a very broad, expansive, imaginative of metaphysic, as well as a theory of knowledge, as well as a theory of ethics. So Socrates in that way is a transitional figure towards him, but also teaches him the way forward is by examining and thinking through things, as it were.
So Socrates does believe in what was the language we used earlier? Some sort of absolute truth.
Yes.
But he also doesn't believe that he or anybody else can really know it.
Well, I think that might be too strong. He would say, I don't know what things are. Like, I don't know what justice is, so I want to learn.
I don't know what it is, but you certainly don't either.
Yes.
So.
But I don't think he'd say it's impossible to know it. He would just say our stance should be that we should not use it so flippantly and shallowly. We should seek to think through and understand it.
I got you. But he doesn't get there, which is interesting, at least in Plato.
Well, again, not all of them. Again, Plato is going to give a very descriptive and positive affirmation of what justice is, what good is, what beauty is. So the earlier dialogues are much more like this, and some of the later ones are.
I can see
a little bit differently.
I can see why people would think that the earlier ones were more likely authentic if they shift in that sort of direction of becoming more positive, especially if we know that he got killed for this kind of stuff by the public. I mean, even in that scene, you see the one guy kind of peace out and like, yeah, no, I'm out.
Yeah. So that is his life, and that's his influence. Again, he did not write anything, so it's not like we can analyze his writing. We only see him through the eyes of Plato and a couple other writers of that time who wrote like plays, and he was a figure in some of those. but he was able to really pave the way in many ways, not just in his form, but many of his ideas for Plato and Aristotle.
But that's got to be hard to see that distinction of where Socrates ends and where Plato starts.
Yeah,
just by
it
the
is.
nature of it.
Yeah, it's one of those areas where historians who specialize in the field argue about it.
Yeah.
So that tells you that's not a clear-cut answer.
But either way, it's still formative for us now and kind of being downstream of it.
Right.
So.
Yep. And now next time, we're going to begin talking about Plato. We may have a few episodes that aren't on topic of the history of philosophy. I'm going to work that out a little bit this week. But Plato is going to be arguably the most influential philosopher, possibly thinker, in the Western world, at least in the Greek and the European, and therefore the American mindset. Aristotle coming right after him. I mean, you could argue about which one is more influential. Aristotle was much broader, but Plato is the one who synthesized all the issues of the pre-Socratic philosophers, gave his own original synthesis and interpretation and advancement upon that. And then Aristotle corrected and built upon that, but it was Plato who was really the original great philosopher.
Wow. Yeah. That's a lot, and that's exciting to piece out over a number of episodes, so
yeah,
that'll be good.
Yeah, and especially because Plato had incredible, profound influence on Christian theology. Christian theology is primarily going to be formed in its essentials in the 2nd through 4th centuries. And during that time period, Aristotle's not really on the scene because his writings are not extant. That means that the people who are doing that Christian philosophy don't have access to them. They are not going to be rediscovered till centuries later. And then Thomas Aquinas is going to be the one who synthesizes Christianity with Aristotle. But that's a Christianity that's already been synthesized and profoundly influenced by Plato.
So Thomas is Aristotle's.
Yeah, he is in the lineage.
The joke now makes sense for everybody to whom it didn't make sense earlier.
Yes, exactly. So early Christian theology was a combination primarily of biblical revelation and Plato, especially as Plato is going to be modified by the Neoplatonists to that. And that includes most of the early Christian theologians, including and especially Augustine. And then Aquinas is going to, he's going to come along almost 1,000 years after Christ.
Yeah.
And also then begin synthesizing it with Aristotle. But that's, again, the theology that's already formed by a synthesis with Plato. And so you really can't understand Christian theology without understanding Plato.
And that's part of the whole point of this podcast. And I think that that's a really important thing for everybody to understand is the way that, you mentioned Alexander the Great being one of the apprentices or disciples or mentees of Aristotle. And when the Greek Empire expands,
exactly,
then Greek influence and then Roman influence is all over the place. But as the gospel spreads out of Israel into Rome and Corinth and Thessalonica and these places, there's prevalent Greek thought. And so that's the Hellenistic influence, right?
Exactly. Hellenistic, for those who aren't familiar, is just another term for Greek culture and language. And again, you're exactly right. I'm glad you brought that out. Through Alexander the Great and those who came after him, Greek influence, thought categories, and language spread throughout the entire Middle Eastern and Mediterranean basin.
So it's not an intentional move to fuse Greek thought with Hebrew thought. It's the natural theology that's happening out of these contexts that are Greek and Jewish.
Yes. Now, some of them were more specific and intentional, the way that some thinkers were doing that more intentionally, but yeah, you couldn't get away from it.
So you've got, Paul is that in essence. Trained as a Pharisee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then going and trying to do the work of theology in these contexts that are super heavily influenced by Greek thought.
Yes. Yeah. And he was born not in Judea, but in a place that would be Greek Roman influence. So again, even when the Romans come along, they don't really change the categories of thought or even that much from Greek philosophy. They basically Latinize everything.
Mhm.
They even take the Greek gods, even with Latin names. They do the same thing with most of the philosophical and religious categories of thought that the Greeks had.
Yeah. And so then, I mean, when you've got guys who come later down the road, like you're talking about with Augustine,
Mm-hmm.
so he's Greek, right?
No, he's Roman.
He's
Well,
Roman.
he grew up in the Roman Empire.
Right.
Yeah.
Where was he? He's in Africa, right?
Well, he settled in Hippo, which was in North Africa, yeah. But he's got influences from other places as well.
But then he becomes Christian and he reads the Hebrew scripture and even the New Testament and everything. And then,
Right.
I mean, he's doing theology from from the way he's been trained with the Roman and Greek influence and then the Christian influence. So,
Right. And he was a Roman and Greek philosopher or thinker before he was a Christian. So he's going to think in those terms by default.
yeah. So, I mean, just piecing out the location of this, and it's clear to see the way that Christianity's been influenced by this, and a lot of the Western world that has been shaped by Christian thought, and Christians going and trying to evangelize and that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
So it's feeling very weighty now, getting into Plato and Aristotle, seeing, okay, this is really helpful to understand Christian thought, especially New Testament.
Yeah.
So.
And that's kind of the burden that gave birth to this podcast.
Yeah.
This isn't just an academic exercise, I feel, and many people, I think, it's not my own viewpoint, but the church has been profoundly influenced by Greek thought, which influences the very way that we Americans interpret the Bible. We think we're coming at it from a blank slate, but we're not. We're coming through it from a cultural viewpoint that has been profoundly shaped by the people we're talking about. And unless we see that, we're not going to be able to discern what's good and bad in that.
Yeah.
And that's what's bugging me.
So you want to examine the lens through which we understand Christianity.
Good way to put that, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a tough thing to do, but I think that this is helping. I mean, just seeing, okay, this is the groundwork that's being laid here, and you talk about the way Christianity has affected Western society, and then, I mean, I think with political theory and seeing how Plato's going to affect it, like that's going to be huge.
Yeah, it will.
So that's the next, how many, 4 or 5, 3 to 5, 7, haven't quite mapped it out yet, but it's going to be a number of episodes here.
Yeah, I mean, you could do an unlimited amount almost, but we'll try to keep it to 3 to 5, I think, on Plato, and then several on Aristotle, and then we'll come back to Plato in a sense because we'll have to talk about Neoplatonism. Yeah.
Well, cool.
All right.
Well, until then, that'll be fun.
Until then, thanks for helping out.
Thanks, Daniel.
See you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you hear, click follow or subscribe depending on your platform. Check the notification bell so you're up to date with new episodes and leave us a review. Until next time.